Good afternoon, folks. My name is Andres Pena, and I'm here on behalf of Miami's community newspapers with Victor Williams, who is here today to talk about something that is a very serious topic, something that many people in government, our communities are trying to work to solve. We're here to talk about human trafficking. And Victor Williams, you, sir, you have a very extensive background on this. You've told me that you've worked for many years with Homeland Security, with the Department of Homeland Security.
Yes.
You've worked with the NBA, with the
Yes.
Atlanta Hawks.
Yes.
And you've also worked for the state of Georgia. Talk to me a little bit about your background in this field.
Yeah. Like I said, I'm a retired special agent with Homeland Security Investigations. The last 8 years of my career, I worked human trafficking, which changed me as a human being. When I retired in 2018, I initially started working with an organization that we traveled around the country educating law enforcement in human trafficking. And then I had this opportunity to go work with the Atlanta Hawks. So how can you turn that down? Great experience, really a great experience, but it really wasn't feeding my soul. And when I left, the state of Georgia had gotten their grant money to address human trafficking for the state of Georgia. And I ended up becoming the human trafficking coordinator for the state of Georgia for a year.
Fascinating. And I hear you've also done work with the NBA as an organization as well, right?
Yeah, I did team security for 2 years with the NBA. And then to just, go further, this season, the NBA security conference was held here in Atlanta. And I ended up doing a presentation for them. You want me to tell you why?
Sure. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
so basically, I won't give the city, but a father took his 15-year-old daughter to a game. She went to the bathroom, and the next time he saw his daughter was 11 days later when they were rescuing her out of a hotel being sold for sex. So that was the reason, one of the reasons why I did the NBA, did a presentation on human trafficking at the NBA security conference.
Yeah, I can imagine for fans that shakes their sense of safety and security at these games. It behooves the NBA to make sure that they stay on top of these kinds
Oh
of
yeah,
things.
and I will say it wasn't Miami, so people can feel safe.
That's good. That's good. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good to hear. So talk to me a little bit about the different kinds of human trafficking that happen both here in the United States and abroad. I know that you mentioned that there's labor trafficking, but
Yeah.
then there's also sex trafficking.
Right. So let's define human trafficking. You need three elements to define human trafficking, and they are force, fraud, and coercion. Force is obviously I beat you to make you do what I want you to do. Coercion is the threat of hurting you, somebody you love, not giving you drugs, not giving you food, kicking you out the house, anything that you think you may need that people can hold over you and make you do things because you think you need it, that's coercion. Fraud is the weakest of the three elements because prosecutors believe if I say, hey, come to Miami, be a model, and you get here and I want you to do other things, you should be able to say, no, I'm not doing that and walk away. But usually they get you here on come to Miami, be a model, and they use force and coercion to keep you. There are four types of trafficking. It's sex trafficking, obviously, that's what everybody talks about. Then you have servitude debt bondage. That's when you bring people over to work for you, or I pay you to get me here and I'm in debt to you and I never really pay that debt off. And then there's organ trafficking where we've heard about it. I've never done an organ trafficking case. Don't know anybody who's done one, but January was Human Trafficking Awareness Month, and I was on the radio with the new mayor of North Miami. That's a heavily community of Haitians, and they were being exploited in this way where they would get a call saying, hey, your loved one's in the hospital. When they get there, oh, your loved one died and we're removing their organs. And that's where people are not familiar with our laws and their rights. And so don't know the hospitals. We're, something we're looking into, but that was really educational for me.
Wow.
The last form, and I saved that for the last because this involves everybody, including myself, labor trafficking. If you own a cell phone, you buy food or clothing, you have a minimum of 40 to 60 slaves working for you, right? So basically what I'm saying is if you're buying products from slave labor, whether you know it or not, we're all part of the problem, and that's what we do. We want to educate people to be more mindful of the products that they buy. because nobody cares unless it's happened to someone they love. So we're kind of distanced from a lot of stuff. But believe me, Miami is filled with a lot of labor trafficking in the city.
Interesting. So you've told me previously that that the three states that have the most amount of human trafficking, that have this problem,
Yes.
seriously at their doorstep. You said it was California, Texas, and Florida.
Right.
What makes these states stand out more than the rest as far as risk goes for trafficking?
Agriculture, really. Those, if you look at those three states, they're huge in agriculture, right? So labor trafficking. Like I was telling you, when I first started human trafficking, when I first got my first lesson, I was in Africa at the International Law Enforcement Academy in Botswana. I was assigned to the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force. I go there, I get my first lesson in human trafficking, and they mention modern day slavery in America. I'm like, hey, well, really? I get back to the States, my time is up with the FBI. I come back to Homeland Security. I ended up in the human trafficking group where one of my colleagues had an investigation of about 8 or 9 women being trafficked from Mexico. And let me clear this up right now. Most sex trafficking victims are Americans. Most labor trafficking victims come from other countries, and we'll explain that later. But this one woman, and to make this story short, these guys were going to go to trial. They were saying that we're not trafficking until we figured out that it was a woman, part of the group, that was keeping them afraid because she was part of the trafficking family. We pull her out, send her back home, and all the women come clean. Now the men plea, and now they're in sentencing, and we're at this point where the victims are given their impact statements. And this is what, again, further changed my life, is when this woman got on and talked about how they took her at the age of 14. They brought her here to service the people. If you ever been to Homestead and watched these people that pick the foods that we eat, the vegetables, it's a dirty job. These men didn't go home, take a shower, clean up, and then go to the trailer where she was serving sexually, I call it rape, 15 to 25 men a day. They didn't dress up, they didn't clean up, they came from those dirty fields, and they hear the woman talking about the disgusting things that she had to do to these men. It really changed me, and something hit me, and for some reason, I knew I would be working in this space for a long time.
So you mentioned that when you were working for the Atlanta Hawks, that it wasn't, there was something missing about the work that you were doing there that made you want to do more, and it led you to create the business that you're now working with, Quest to Freedom.
Yeah.
Talk to me a little bit about what you do.
Yeah, so after leaving the Hawks, and I say this, that, you can't really outrun your passion and your purpose in life when because it'll keep drawing you in. So when I left the Hawks, fortunately, I was going to come back to Miami, but the state of Georgia got the funding, and I ended up becoming the human trafficking coordinator for the state. I did that for a year, but I really wanted to be back in Miami. I came back to Miami, kind of didn't do anything. Once I did the presentation for the NBA, it kind of got my sparks going again. And when I retired in 2018, I bought the domain Quest to Freedom. But now what I'm doing with Quest to Freedom is what I always had intended. Quest to Freedom is an anti-human trafficking organization that educates the community on the cultural awareness that creates human trafficking and keeps it going. And then we also are positioning ourselves to help victims in their immediate needs. When I was an agent with Homeland, when I worked for the state of Georgia, we had to come to organizations like mine when we came across victims to get them hotel for a few days or a week, or food, or whatever they needed in that immediate need, so they don't run back to their trafficker until they got to their long-term care. So that's basically what we do and how we operate.
Do you coordinate what you guys do? Do you coordinate with other community organizations and state governments and law
Yeah, I
enforcement?
mean, I've been at this. I started the organization in December, but we really went live January 3rd when we filed our paperwork, and we are just last week got our 501c3 authorization, which says it's a tax break for people who donate to us. So now, we're still building the foundation and really getting positioned to hope to be one of those organizations. When we talk about the hotline, PolarisProject.org is the organization that monitors a hotline, but they monitor based on the calls. That's how we get the standings that we find out that California's 1, Texas 2, and Florida's number 3 by the phone calls, right? So I'm hoping to establish myself that I become a service provider that's listed on their programs. Because if you're a trafficking victim or you know someone being trafficked, you call the hotline, by the way, which is 888-3737-888. You call that hotline, you let them know where you are, and their job is to find services for you. Either you want the police involved or you don't. That's what they do, and I'm hoping to get set up where we become one of those service organizations that is on their list of services.
So you mentioned that part of the work that you do is educating people on the cultural causes. Talk to me a little bit about different facets of our society that happen to make people more vulnerable or create these victims of trafficking.
Right. So understanding culture is understanding mindset, and this is one that we talked about earlier. I'm sure people have heard the saying, prostitution, the world's oldest profession. It's because men are the world's oldest customer. But we live in a culture that we demonize the person that's selling and who could be a potential victim, then demonizing the people who are creating the market. And by the way, farming is the world's oldest profession, right? So yeah, culture. I mean, I tell parents in today's world, parents, your job is to have a relationship with your child that they can tell you anything, because if you don't, if they can't come to you, who do they go to? Human trafficking is the results of a lot of things that have already gone wrong in somebody's life. And those are the things that Quest to Freedom addresses. Trafficking victims are created at home. Families have trauma. Unresolved trauma makes people vulnerable, and vulnerability is what traffickers seek to exploit.
Interesting. And the ways that these vulnerabilities tend to occur is at home, and then what happens from there? How does the situation worsen?
So, we tend to raise our kids the way we were raised. From the moment you're being born to 7 years old, we're programming our kids to be wherever they're going to be, And if I had trauma and it unresolved, I'm most likely passing that trauma on to my kid. So it's generational trauma until somebody recognizes that and break that chain, right? Because again, it's the trauma that creates the vulnerability. The unresolved trauma creates the vulnerability. So parents, if you got these issues, make sure you're addressing your trauma issues so you're not passing it on to your kids, so that, we can address those issues. In America, we just started accepting mental illness as an illness. It's always been there, but now we're realizing that, there's a lot of people out there that are, ill. And we need to start looking at this and addressing it in a right way. So, victims are created at home. It's something even more startling. The trafficker is created at home, because you got to ask yourself, what happened to this individual to treat other individuals that way? We're a creature of our environment. If I'm being brought up in an environment that this is all I see, it is what I see. And I remember us talking, and you brought up, people that are not part of those environments. And I told you, well, the problem with that is that people that are not part of that environment either exploiting that environment or become victims themselves. For instance, Fort Lauderdale was one of the cities that I've only known to be able to do this. They were able to tell you how many kids that were trafficked in Fort Lauderdale, their ethnicity, what part of Fort Lauderdale they came from, but the most, surprising number was the majority of cases, no matter if you had 100 kids, 150 or 50 kids, 80 to 90% of those kids were community kids. Those are kids that are not part of the juvenile justice systems. Those are the kids that are not part of that poor community that are most vulnerable. And why? Because traffickers see that those good kids, nobody's watching. And these kids are vulnerable because, hey, let me get this kid to a party. Let me get pictures and get them in a compromise and use that. I've seen cases where kids are being trafficked living at home with their parents, and their parents have no idea.
So many of these stories end up so beginning with such a tragic note, and it's something that, especially in this country, has been very hotly debated in various spaces. And I know you were talking earlier about different ways to handle the laws surrounding sex work,
Yes.
and the both the you described it, the buying and the selling. That
Right.
those are two separate components that can
Right.
be handled separately. So
So
talk to
yeah,
me a little bit
before I
about
go
that.
there, I want to say, parents, you buy the phone, you have the internet. Make sure you're monitoring your kids on the internet.
Right.
Internet safety. If your kids are playing games, they've probably been approached. If you're not monitoring it, people are pretending to be kids to get information, to get access to your kids. Please monitor your phone. So sex work, legalize it, decriminalize. There are talks about decriminalizing the selling and buying. I'm not for that yet. What I'm for is what years ago was called the Nordic model, but now it's called the equitable model here in the United States. And what does that mean? Let's try this. Let's try legalizing the selling of sex and keep the buying of sex illegal. And I know when I said that to you earlier, you had to go, wait a minute, let me think about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's culture. Like I said, we demonize the person that's selling when we should be demonize the people that are creating the market. But before we decriminalize both of those situations, let's try that first because it changes culture. It changes culture when, okay, yeah, it's legal for you to sell, so I'm not putting you in jail for you trying to survive. And like I said to you earlier, I don't work in a world where I judge anybody for what they choose to do. I only live in that world where people are forced to do things that they don't want to do. But that world runs it's a thin line.
Mm-hmm.
And you can only tell the difference if you know what's happening in somebody's head.
Yeah.
Right.
And you're a big believer in changing the culture, as you've stated. What are some of the ways that people can educate themselves, that they can learn more? As you said yourself, that even people in law enforcement sometimes aren't completely aware of how to handle these kinds of situations.
Right.
And you had mentioned, doing research, how to determine whether or not what you're buying, if you're buying a, chocolate bar, whether or not
Yeah.
it's as you described it, fairly traded. Talk a little bit about
Right.
that.
So we talked about trade. We talk about labor trafficking, and I said, like, if you eat chocolate, because I used to have my presentations, and at the end I used to tell people, now that you know, what are you going to do? Now we're going to give people things to do. And let's just start with coffee and chocolate. If you buy coffee and you eat chocolate, go to the internet. Let's Google your product to see if it's fair traded. For instance, if you don't fair trade the chocolate products that you eat, possibly the beginning processes of that chocolate product starts on the west coast of Africa with a stolen or sold child picking a cocoa bean, right? So this is the labor trafficking stuff that we don't know, that we don't see. I said to you earlier that Human Trafficking Awareness Month is in January. Why aren't companies waving that flag? Because sometimes these companies have those issues from the moment products are being made to their coming to you buying them. There's some issues in between there. Because we wave the flag for every other month, why aren't companies waving the flag for the number one crime in the world? It is the number one crime in the world.
And to that point, I mean, I know from a few years ago that Nike, Adidas, all these clothing and sports gear companies were having this issue when it came to exporting jobs and work to China.
Yes.
And now, situation in China is happening, right? We're starting to put more restrictions on that, but these companies never really figured out their issue. What they did was they took their business and moved to another country that did the same exact thing. They did it in Malaysia, Vietnam, or Thailand and stuff. And the problem is that not enough people know about it.
Yeah.
And they kind of just glide along as if it's not there. And it's tough because oftentimes the situation is that if it's not right in front of me, if I don't see it, then it doesn't exist.
And that's it. What we don't know, we don't care. And everybody knows human trafficking is bad, but they don't know how. They're only thinking about it in the sex trafficking. They're only thinking about it from the movie Taken. we're not doing enough education in our schools. Now, I'll say, some experts say drugs are still number one. But how do you factor everybody having a cell phone? Not everybody buys drugs. And some experts say by 2030, trafficking will be the number one crime. We know how statistics work. If they're saying it by 2030, it's probably already. I have no doubt that human trafficking is the number one crime in the world. And for instance, like you were saying, I never hear anybody say, "Oh, my daughter's stripping tonight. Let's go to the strip club." Or my mom. It's easy for us to go to places like that. And those are legal entities. And again, I'm not judging people who do what they do legally, but there are victims of human trafficking in strip clubs, right? And you can't tell the difference. And one of the things that we did in this space is stop showing pictures of trafficking victims tied up, because that's what we look for. They look just like you and me. There's an increase of 40, when I retired in 2018, there was an increase of 46% of boys and men being trafficked. But those numbers aren't coming out because, again, in that LGBTQ plus community, they're getting killed in this area because no one would hire them because they're choosing the people that they love. There's another component, benefit fraud. We're not looking at our elderly people that are being exploited for their Social Security checks or their VA checks. This is huge because we haven't even done any parameters or guidance in that. I know Ms. Rundle's office is looking into elderly abuse cases now, but these are things that we're not talking about. It is the number one crime in the world.
And I think it's important to notice the methodology that a lot of these traffickers use. You mentioned that when it comes to labor statistics, if someone's immigrating over, first thing that a trafficker will want to do is take away someone's documents,
Right.
to basically to have control over these people, which
Yes.
is horrendous, a horrendous thing to do. And these people don't even realize that what they're doing to them is a crime. You're not allowed to take
Right.
someone's documents away. This is how they travel. This is how
Exactly.
they find a job.
Yes.
And if you control all of those factors, then you get to determine whether or not someone can build a livelihood in the place that they're immigrating to.
Because they don't like what they're doing here. And I'm glad you brought that up, because what we do is educate people on these rights. They have rights. So even when you're brought here legally, and that's exactly what happens. Oh, I'm responsible for you, so I got to take your ID. I got to take your passport. You just eliminated all those possibilities. You just said, I can't get on a bus, plane, or train. I can't go apply for another job. So if you're abusing me, where am I going? What am I going to do? Because I don't have an ID.
Yeah.
So yeah, and it's against the law to do that. So people need to know.
Yeah, and one of the other components that is very important for people to realize, and then this is something that you mentioned, that the state of Georgia, state of Florida, it took them a very long time
Yes.
to get rid of the laws that allowed arrests of victims.
Right.
Right? Because normally, as you mentioned, that they target the person that's doing the prostitution, that's doing the sex work,
Right.
when most often they're the ones being victimized.
Right. So yeah, our first laws on trafficking came the year 2000, when the United Nations brought all countries to Palermo, Italy, and charged all countries to deal with their human trafficking issue. That's when we had the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, the TVPA. There's been some modifications over the year, but in that first act in 2000, when I told you what the three elements are of human trafficking, force, fraud, or coercion, those elements only apply to adults. They don't apply to children. So if children were being commercially, sexually exploited, prostituted, they were victims. It took Florida 16 years to finally pass that law. Prior to that, it was 12 years when we came up with the Safe Harbor Act, which gave officers other options than arresting. But to finally put a law, no more arresting kids for prostitution, because they were victims since day one. It took Georgia 19 years. And there may still be states out there arresting kids for prostitution. So changing culture is hard. And the only way we change culture, and this is what I've been talking about, we have to educate people to the level that they understand the issue. And then we have to have policies and laws in place to enforce. For instance, as a law enforcement guy, if I had a simple misdemeanor domestic violence situation, I lose my gun, I lose my job. If I had a DUI situation, I lose my license, I lose my jobs. These are policies put in place. But the third factor to completely understanding the changing of culture, it always comes back to us. When we're faced with these situations, what choices are we going to make? And we're going to make those, and a lot of times we make those choices based off the lack of information. Every day should be Human Trafficking Awareness Day and month. This is the number one crime in the world. Your kids are vulnerable just being kids. And if you're not preparing them and giving them the support to understand, how to operate, giving them the love that they don't have to go out seeking love from other people, because we all want to belong. And the difference, there's no difference in the kid that goes to college, join a gang, or strap on a bomb and go blow. Those kids left the house vulnerable, and they ran into the wrong people that exploited the vulnerability. So this is how we got to look at it. We need to change how we're dealing with our children. We need to be honest with them and talk to them about this stuff.
I know that it's a very complex problem. It has legs and arms reaching out beyond countries' borders. This is a very interconnected issue that is going to take a lot of heavy lifting in order to resolve. But to avoid being overwhelmed, I think a good place to start for folks that want to get more involved, that want to help, would be your website, right? Quest2freedom.org. They can go, they can start learning about how to help with these issues, how to find victims, how to figure out how to handle those kinds of situations. Because I think for a lot of people, it's a little nerve-wracking because, if you're walking around and you see someone that you suspect may be a victim, your first instinct is, oh, I don't want to get involved, right? I don't want to get in trouble. I don't want somebody to come after me, right? And the fact of the matter is that if you educate yourself on who you can call, who you can get in contact with, you've already taken that first step.
And I tell people to be good witnesses. I'm not asking you to get involved, but remember back in the day, you look a little young, so you may not know. There was a time that domestic violence, people like, oh, that's a family thing, turn away. But it's not. Violence is never the answer. So we educated people. Now, if that's happening to you, you want somebody to call the police. If that's happening to your loved one, you want somebody to get involved. So we tell people to be good witnesses. Get your phone out, take a picture. Identify, get that license plate number, get as much information you can from a safe position and forward that information to the police. Be good witnesses. If you think you can get in there and do something, do what you can do, but we don't ask people to jeopardize themselves in that manner. But being a good witness, taking good documentation so you can pass that on goes a long way in helping people.
So regretfully, we are starting to run a little tight on time. I really wish we could sit here and continue on this conversation because it's such an important conversation to have. But I do want to give you a moment to be able to address the audience here. If you wanted to look into the camera and pass along a message, I give you now the stage to do that.
Thanks. And parents, this is about you and your family. This is about your kids. Please educate yourself. Please, establish that relationship. Understand how trauma is affecting you and affecting your family. Get help. It's okay to not be okay. Explain that to your children. Monitor their use of the internet. Be involved in their lives. Understand who their friends are. Understand who their friends' parents are. There's so many, we could have this conversation for hours. There's so many stories. But this is the most important thing. We must educate ourselves. Share this with your community. Have community events where you invite experts to come in and educate your community about this. There's ways, and I honestly believe we can fix this. I'm so passionate about this because when I started this work and what I've learned, it changed me as a human being because there were a pre-human trafficking victim. But now, knowing what I know and knowing how it has changed my life, if most men know what I know, we can fix a lot of this. So that's really, to the parents out there, really look at your issues that you're not passing it on to your kids so your kids are safer. Thank you.
And to those folks at home, if you wanted to share the hotlines they can call, websites they can start
You're gonna
researching.
post those, but like I said, you got the 800, the 888-3737 888 number, which is the national hotline run by PolarisProject.org. You have the Department of Homeland Security hotline, which is 1-866-347-2423, and then you have the Coordinated Victim Assistance Center, CVAC, which is I'm the vice chair of the Miami-Dade Human Trafficking Coalition. CVAC is a service-provided organization. If you're a victim of rape, human trafficking, sexual assault, call that number, 305-285-5900, to get services to help you through your process.
If for those at home, please utilize these tools. They're available to you because we want to help. People are out there that are dedicated to this. They've spent their entire lives, as you have, in their careers, trying their best to help people out. And if you happen to be in trouble, or if you know someone who is in trouble, please do not be afraid to use these resources. They're out there for you. They're out there for your loved ones, for your family and your friends. And to those at home, thank you so much, Victor Williams.
Thank you for having me.
And folks at home, please have a nice day.